Hi, welcome to another episode of Dialogues with me, Richard Reeves. Today I'm talking to Liz Bruenig, who's an opinion writer on the New York Times. And I really wanted to talk to her because of her recent reporting and writing on the return of the federal death penalty. Just towards the end of Donald Trump's term in office, there were 13 executions, and they were the first federal executions for 17 years. And we talk about why that happened, what Bill Barr and Donald Trump did to bring the federal death penalty back, and also what that means going forward, both for states and the federal government. And along the way, we talk about some of the moral and theological arguments around the death penalty, how the politics and policy has really shifted over the last few decades. And Liz also shares her own experience of witnessing the execution in Indiana at the end of 2020. And she also shares how a murder actually in her own close family has informed some of her own thinking and work in this area. I learned a great deal from her writing and reporting. I'll be honest, I didn't know quite the extent of the return of the federal death penalty until I read her work, and I really wanted to dig into that more deeply with her. And so I also learned a huge amount from the conversation on this really important issue, and I hope you do too. Liz Bruenig, welcome to Dialogues.
Thanks so much for having me on.
It's really exciting to meet you. I guess this is what counts as meeting now. One of my junior team members was very excited that I was going to be talking to you. A big fan of yours. Said you're a great writer and also great on Twitter. And I must admit, I do follow you on Twitter, and I think you have a great voice there as well. One of the things that strikes me about it is your willingness to be very open about sort of domestic concerns and achievements. Yeah. Why not, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, domestic labor, domestic production, whatever you want to call it, housework, which is probably how most of us think of it. It's such a fraught domain, right? Because this becomes the sort of battleground of the feminism of the 1960s and 70s. In the post-war America, you have this period of sort of peace and relative prosperity, and the suburbs explode, and suddenly you have women in middle and upper class households anyway, spending a lot of their time indoors in your average ranch home, doing domestic labor. And domestic labor has also changed quite a bit in this period because household appliances have been, have had widespread uptake. So it's actually much less laborious than it once was to clean a carpet, wash dishes. You even get mixers, hand beaters, and stand mixers, things that make baking bread or making cakes much less laborious than they once were. These used to be physically demanding, and washing clothes especially. You think about hauling around as a laundress if you were if you were working as a laundress or doing your own laundry. You think about hauling around, 10, 20 soaking wet articles of clothing. You're talking about a lot of weightlifting. And so these things were really demanding. And then you enter a period where they become quite a bit less so. And I think that accounts for why this labor that's really important. It has to be done. It has to get done.
Someone's doing it, but you show it. It feels. I'm glad you said that because it feels somewhat intentional to me. And it's obviously fun. You had these great homemade oatmeal cream pies on the other day, but it also really struck me the other day because you had this beautiful piece of embroidery that you'd done for your daughter, I think. And I was actually just watching it. I just watched Enola Holmes, and there's this. I don't know if you've watched the movie Enola Holmes. You have young kids, so I mean, but
it's been a while.
But if my experience is anything to go by, there's like a 5-year period where you miss all the movies, and then 20 years later you can go back and watch them again. But there's this great scene where she lists all the things she doesn't do, and one of them is I don't embroider, and this guy says in response to her, says you don't embroider, and I was listening to that, I'd just seen your beautiful embroidery, and so what it felt to me is if the Holmes movie was taking like a traditional feminist stance, which is of course I don't embroider, and there's you showing your embroidery and taking kind of delight in it. That does feel like an assertion of someone's doing this, I like doing, I'm not going to share. But I also wonder if you get heat on Twitter for all kinds of things, but do you get any heat for that kind of thing, for being so intentionally open about this domestic, not just domestic labor, but domestic joy to some extent from certain kinds of feminists?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's a lot of, why did the New York Times hire a mommy blogger? And why don't you just quit and be a stay-at-home mom, et cetera, things like that. There's a lot of allegations of being a trad wife, a traditional wife.
I know a bit about the trad wife movement.
Yeah, and my perspective is just, look, you went through this period in the 60s and 70s where there was an intentional underscoring of how trifling and ridiculous and meaningless and unfulfilling this work is. And yet someone still has to do this work. And I take a bit of pride in doing it in a skilled way. And I work it just like any other skill. The cooking, the baking, meal planning, prep, preservation, sewing, embroidery. Those are skills. It's skilled work. I develop it. I'm constantly working on it. I read about it. It's no joke. And I think that there's nothing more respectful of the people who do that kind of labor day in, day out, whether they be cleaning ladies, people who come and perform that labor in lieu of a homeowner or a residence owner, people who cook for families, etc. Then to recognize this is skilled work, and it's important, and it can be just as fulfilling and can register the same feelings of achievement as any other kind of work. And there's nothing to be ashamed of.
To hide it. Yeah, it's almost
right.
Like the work that was not allowed to speak its name for a while, that you're sort of letting down the cause somehow.
Yes, and also it's fine to be traditionally feminine. There's nothing wrong with those things. There's nothing wrong with being a woman. Iggy Pop has a great quote where he says, I don't mind dressing up like a woman because I don't think there's anything wrong with being a woman.
Yeah,
Same.
Well, again,
I agree.
Perhaps I'll have you back. I'm trying to write a book about boys and men right now, and how we think about masculinity and femininity, and how we can escape from these boxes. But that's probably kind of yes. Well, we should have another conversation about that. But if anybody needed evidence that, despite your intentional, I think, valuing of that kind of labor, that you're not a mommy blogger, they would only have to read the work you've been doing recently over the last few months. Really been doing some terrific reporting on the re-emergence of the federal death penalty. And it's just extraordinary. And I will admit that until I really started looking into it and following your work, and I just didn't know that we'd seen this sort of death rush, if you like, under kind of Trump, and that of the 17 people that the federal government has executed in the last 60 years, am I getting that right? 13 was in the last year or so, right? Just over the last year.
7 or 8 months, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just I'll get into kind of the politics of that just in a moment, but it was just, and I think your reporting has really drawn attention to a lot of us to that, that kind of upsurge recently. And I want to get into that I'm going to talk about the morality and theology of that, the politics and public opinion, but I also just want to start with your own sort of personal experience. You wrote this terrific piece about your own experience. So Alfred Bourgeois, who you write about, he was pronounced dead at 8:21 p.m. on Friday, December the 11th, having taken more than 20 minutes to die. Mm-hmm. And you were there in Indiana as he died. As he was one of the people that you've been writing about. And you witnessed what you described as brutality cloaked in sterile procedure. I have 2 questions for you about this, if you're willing to answer them. One is, why did you go to experience it firsthand? And secondly, describe the experience of those 20 minutes for you.
Yeah, so I went because I'm against the death penalty for a lot of reasons. And at the same time, I certainly understand why people feel compelled by it. And I think one of the reasons that it's so compelling is that the murders, the crimes, always wind up rendered very graphically in the press, which I don't mean to insult the press. I think that's, part of the job of the press, tell the truth, right? And so the crimes themselves become very concrete. The victims become very concrete. Everyone remembers the, images of Madeleine McCann right? You can see her face in your mind, right? The victims of crime become people, they become concrete. We relate to them and we sympathize with them as human beings. Executions are hardly ever rendered in that kind of detail. And so the people who are sentenced to die are much more difficult to conceive of as human beings who you could relate with, who you have things in common with, who are people just like you, which I think makes it easier to feel like the death penalty kind of ethically cashes out. It's like this non-human thing committed a horrible crime against a human being who's relatable and lovable. And so, sure, eliminate that sort of non-human entity. But I wanted to render it in full concrete detail, which to me meant not sparing the details of the crime, which I was at pains not to do that. I mean, I read a 2-year-old's autopsy report with an 18-month-old in my lap.
It's worth, I think, just perhaps outlining his crimes, actually, because as you say, you don't you don't flinch from what he did, and there was one point I think where it became even more home to you. Wasn't there a nickname for the daughter that same as yours?
So he had Alfred Bourgeois was a truck driver from Louisiana. He's a Creole. He had a daughter named Jacaren, who he found out about through a paternity hearing in Texas. He went to the paternity hearing. This was his daughter. The mother sent the little girl back with him to Louisiana. At this point, Alfred Bourgeois was already caring for multiple children of his. He was living with his then wife, and he would bring his family with him in his truck when he did long haul deliveries. So a very high pressure, high stress situation. Nevertheless, talking to family members of his, he did introduce this little girl to his family, and it seemed to me was doing what he could to integrate her, but ultimately clearly not at all up to the challenge of taking care of a 2-year-old who's newly dislocated from her mother and grandmother and the only life she'd ever known. And the stress, he wasn't up to it. And he started to abuse her. He would beat her, he would hit her, he would scream at her. He certainly couldn't handle the potty training aspect of dealing with a 2-year-old. So oftentimes in the truck, he would keep her simply strapped to a potty chair, tied down to it. And, come a day, they're in Corpus Christi, Texas, on a military base. And he was doing a delivery, and during the backup, the little girl, Jacaren, knocked over her potty chair. Alfred grabbed her and bashed her head against the inside of the cab of a truck. So, think of it like, we've all heard of shaken baby syndrome. This is that kind of a grabbing and shaking with this added element of the inside cab of a truck.
He was actually bashing her. I mean, sounds like bashing her head against.
Right.
And that's off the back of sustained abuse by the sound that you talk about him forcing her to drink his own urine. And
right.
So it's just, and we'll get into some
terrible.
Some of the stuff.
Horrible. Yeah,
So we'll get into some of the I think some of the things he may not have been guilty of, we might get into a little bit later, but you paint a very vivid picture of just horrific crime against
total
defense.
Cruelty.
And as you say, you had, and actually I think wasn't the same name that you've used for your daughter, Jaja, is that right?
Her name was Jacaren. My daughter's name is Jane. When Jane was little, we called her Jaja. And they too called Jacaren Jaja. And Jacaren, when she died, was 2 years old, and my youngest daughter is about to turn 2. So I would be at home working on writing this piece with Claire sitting in my lap and typing around her, which I do very often. And I'd be looking at Jacaren's autopsy report. And, it's very, very hard to sympathize with this individual.
And I guess that's in the end, maybe not what you're asking us to do. But so you decide to go. You feel like it's important as a reporter and maybe as a person to experience it yourself. And those 20 minutes whilst you were sitting there watching him die, can you describe that?
Yeah, there was also, I guess it's worth adding a political reason, which is the federal government was doing this during the pandemic. So there were, quite natural deterrents for reporters. The federal prisons were hotbeds of COVID, just like a lot of state prisons. Terre Haute had COVID. There was COVID on death row. Some of these people who were put to death either had it or had just had it when they were executed. And people were, COVID was passing during these executions, these specific federal executions. So there was incentive not to do it. And that bothered me. I don't like the idea of the state intentionally trying to exclude the press from something that's public to the press for a very good reason. So we get there, and there's a long waiting period. You sit in a building and you wait while the lawyers try their final appeals for, their final chance at stays. And then nobody can move until the Supreme Court says, no, we're not issuing any more stays. And Terre Haute they will execute someone who still has pending litigation in lower courts, but not the Supreme Court. They'll wait for the Supreme Court. And so, this court is majority conservative. They declined to issue a stay. And around 7, we got moving. And they take you to a unit. They process you. They pat you down. You go through metal detectors. You take off your coat, your sweater. They look inside your mask, everything. And then they put you in white vans and drive you in the dark to this little charnel house. It's a little brick building. Think of it like a wheel and spokes. There's a center chamber, and that's where the gurney is, where the person is murdered, killed, executed. And then you have these rooms, these chambers that surround it with two-way mirrors. So you can see in, the individual cannot see out. That's for the victim's family, the killer's family, and the press. And the lawyers, I believe, are usually, if they want to witness it, where the executed person's, the inmate's family would be.
And in this case, the victim's family weren't, actually, obviously, the daughter had been killed, but I think the mother had also been murdered herself later, right? So
the mother was murdered. Jakaran's mother was murdered shortly after Jakaran's paternity test, because the boyfriend she had been living with believed that Jakaran was his daughter. When he found out she wasn't, he killed the mother, killed himself. The grandmother who had taken care of Jakaran is also dead. So it seems like pretty much everyone who knew this little girl is already dead.
Tragedy heaped upon tragedy. So you're in there. You've been in the middle of the night. I guess under cover of darkness. You've been taken in white vans. You're in the chamber, and they will get into the kind of drug that they use for a moment, but they inject the drug, and then you sit and watch.
Right. It was raining. It was cold, and I had a coat on. I had my heavy coat on and a sweater. We get into the chamber, and it's hot. I have no idea why it was so hot in there, but it's a tight little cinder block room, and with the sort of enamel paint I associate with elementary school classrooms or something. It has plastic chairs and sort of industrial nubby carpet, and it's muggy. The moisture from outside and the heat inside is almost unbearable. And so I am sitting in this chair watching Alfred through the window. The way they strap the individuals to the gurney is cruciform. They have outstretched arms. They're not in a sort of straight line. And you never see when the medication begins. You just see a U.S. Marshal pick up a phone and say, there are no more stays. We can proceed. And then you begin to see the individual change, right? So Alfred, his body began to sort of churn, it looked like, an inhuman kind of gulping, spasming of the belly, an undulation. And they turn off the microphone that transmits sound into the room where the press is, so you don't know if there's any noise being made. You only see what's happening to the individual. And it took a long time. It took over 20 minutes. And I was transfixed the whole time. I guess I felt like, not on an intellectual level, but on an emotional level, watching this, you always feel like, because executions are theater, because it is a performance, it almost sets up expectations like a theater performance. And some part of me felt like, okay, but there's going to be an intervention here. Like they're not actually just going to kill someone right in front of me for no reason. Someone
like
who's
one
not
of those theaters where you're in the round almost.
Right, like an amphitheater.
And at some point someone's going to say, run on the set, and
yeah,
was there part of you that was feeling like it wasn't real?
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that is working, and I'm writing the story in my head, and so that's just a hazard of being a journalist, which is you're in a situation, but it's actually occurring to you as a story. But it's also happening in real life, and you're a part of it. And he stopped moving. There was no intervention. And a person representing themselves as a doctor came in. All of these people, the U.S. Marshals, the doctors, the executioners, are kept anonymous and secret. Their identities are not disclosed to the press. We don't even know where they come from. They bring them in from out of state. This gentleman, introduced as a physician, came in. He was wearing jeans and a plaid shirt. He had a stethoscope, ostensibly checked for vital signs of life, and declared Alfred dead.
Well, he probably did, didn't he? I mean, he probably did check that he was dead.
Yes,
right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I can't, the journalist brain. But he used the stethoscope to check his pulse and his heartbeat and declared him dead. And then they sort of ushered us out, and the other reporters who were old hands at this, because they were local Indiana reporters who had been following this at Terre Haute, just kind of went back out to the van, and I was just sort of out of it. The heat and the humidity and the fact of it and the abruptness with which it's all over. The performance is over. We get back in a van, we go home. I walked out of the room and puked on the pavement. Probably for a lot of reasons, and then got back in the van, and they took us back, and I got a ride home from another reporter, ride back to the hotel, and I spent some time with the lawyers later that evening.
You reported on that.
Yeah, it was dark.
Is it the first death that you've witnessed?
Yes.
So it will always be the case. The first death, almost certainly won't be the last if you're anything like normal humans. Although I hope none quite so. But your first death to be an execution is unusual, to say the least. And it obviously didn't. You allowed space in for your emotions into your reporting. It didn't change your position. You reported at the end that there was just nothing there. There's no sense of redemption or release, or just that there's a sort of a nihilism about the whole thing, that you're kind of just left with an emptiness about it. But to come back, I guess, to why you went down this road in the first place to do such in-depth reporting as you have done over the last few months on this particular issue, because it seems you've clearly come to a view that it's wrong to take someone's life because, as you've written, there's an indelible human dignity that remains intact. And, again, I think I want to dig into that a little bit as to why. Well, let's start that way. Why is that? Why is that where does that come from, right? You take these horrific crimes, these criminals, and you could take examples from history if you wanted to, right? But your view is that no matter how evil, you've actually said that evil and good are always intertwined. No matter how evil what someone has done, there remains something about them that's indelible, something about them, even someone like this, Alfred. Where does that come from?
Oh, on the one hand, I'm Catholic, and so there's a very strong prejudice in favor of human life, and that's something that I lean into full bore. Extremely prejudiced in favor of the human race, so far as to call myself a human chauvinist. I think there's nothing like us. I always return to the selection from Hamlet, right? What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, right? I think that's completely true. I think it's a perfect explanation of what we are, the crowning glory of the entire galaxy. Have you ever seen anything else like us? You know, other animals certainly have their place in the order of things, and they're great. And I mean, most of the time we don't dunk on animals because why would we? It's obvious that when you're hunting a deer, right, and you've got a rifle with a scope on it and a structure you've built, it's pretty clear that you have something on the stag that just can't be matched, right? Unless you want to take on a tiger with no weapons, barehanded or something, with only your wits. That being said, early humans did destroy megafauna. I mean, it's remarkable. And we've been to the moon. I mean,
so there's a sort of uniqueness about us, and for you, because you come at this from this theological perspective with sort of the iron filings almost of divinity, and that remains kind of within everybody, that the kind of hope is always there. I know that you're actually an St. Augustine scholar, and so looking into this a little bit, it doesn't necessarily land in the same place as you, he actually wrote about this he was writing about the Sermon on the Mount, and he was unenthusiastically in favor of the death penalty for reasons that I think were interesting, if I understand them correctly. He said that great and holy men punished some sins with death, both because the living were struck with a salutary fear, right? So we've got deterrence in there, and we can perhaps come on to that. He may just be empirically wrong about that. And then more interestingly, and because it was not death itself that would injure those who were being punished with death, but sin, which might be increased if they continued to live. So it looks as if, in Augustine's thought anyway, there's some quality, purity or hardness of sin that is that's indelible, actually. There's something, and reading your reporting and some of these debates, to bring us back perhaps to the case in question, there's something quite Augustinian about these now, which is it's almost a search for a level of sin that there's a pure evil here, right? So that's why, and you mentioned the case, actually, the Bourgeois case, that actually was, what did for him was the evidence, not conclusive as it turned out, that he actually raped his 2-year-old daughter as well. So, well, if he raped her as well. And so it's like there's a kind of level, it's almost like there's a sinfulness here that has to be blotted out. That's, I think, if I'm understanding Augustine correctly, that's what I think. And I think you disagree that there's ever an amount of kind of sin that is irremovable.
Right. I think, Augustine understands sin to be a degradation or a destruction. That's what evil is. It's non-being, sort of turned towards non-existence. And it's why I think the movie The Witch, a sort of recent horror movie, is a great example of actually how Christians think about it. Very, very quick summary is that there's a witch in sort of colonial New England. You know, it's the 18th century at some point.
This is Salem witch trial time. Forgive my history.
That era, right? These are, I think hardcore Calvinist offshoots from a Puritan colony. And the thing that the devil in the film causes is just degradation and madness. There's no plan. There's no higher logic at work. There's just a breakdown of everything that is good, a dissolution and a destruction. And I think that's actually how evil is. So if someone has degraded themselves through sin, which is what happens when you sin, you degrade yourself, you become less yourself, further away from being a complete human being, then how does killing them help? It just completes the process, right? I mean, like, now they have no opportunity to restore any of that to themselves, right? And so I find that to be very confusing.
I suppose because, and I'm not saying this is right, but I think that the sense is that at some point it becomes the opportunity for restoration just isn't there. that this is clearly the sin has so corroded this person that they have been engulfed by it, and that's kind of how I read Augustine and others, actually, that there is no hope, but that you always offer the hope. Your view is that right to the end, the most heinous criminal possible could still, right to the last, there's always hope for redemption, in your view, for everybody.
Absolutely. God says...
It's less for some than others, right?
Right.
Always
I
hope.
mean, less likely for some than others. I can say I have doubts that person is going to do what they need to do. But, God says, is anything too hard for the Lord? Paul is at the stoning of Stephen. He helped round up Christians to be killed. And then he became the Apostle Paul. Right?
Yes, yes. So you write about how evil is always entwined with good, and you can't separate them either within the individual either. But I think I also wanted to ask you a bit about your personal experience of this, because I do think you can bring various perspectives to bear here, which is that this is not just a hypothetical for you. I think a lot of people probably, to some extent, go along with being, of course, I'm against the death penalty. Maybe we haven't thought about it very much, or had maybe not experienced a situation where that's put to the test. But you've had a experience through your family which did put that to the test, at least for your own family members. Would you mind describing that and whether or not that influenced you at all in this direction?
Sure. So my husband and I grew up in the same town in Texas called Arlington. He lived around the corner from me. We met in high school on the debate team. His older sister was older than him by 18 months. Her name was Heather. And she also went to our school. I knew her. I knew him. And in 2016, June of that year, shortly after our first daughter was born, Matt got a call from his dad, and his dad said Heather had been killed, that she was dead. And Matt came and told me, and I said, well, was it an accident? And he said, no, she was murdered. They know who did it. It didn't take them long to apprehend the individual, because after he killed her, he stole her car and was still covered in her blood when he was arrested. The reason it didn't end up having the elements of a capital crime were with issues of diminished capacity. There were drugs involved. But Matt, my husband, we didn't know that right off the cuff.
It could have been a capital crime as far as
it could easily
knew.
have been a capital crime in Texas. And Tarrant County is one of the most reliably read counties in the country. Not just Texas, but the entire nation. And the likelihood that they would seek capital punishment and get it in this kind of a case seemed pretty good to my husband and I. And so Matt packed a suitcase, went home, helped his parents arrange the funeral, and spoke to the detectives and the prosecutor and said, look, we don't want anyone to seek capital punishment. We're not interested in that. There are a lot of reasons for that, right? Because I think a lot of people don't realize this, but when you get a capital sentence, this is not over for the victim's family. They end up getting contacted over and over and over again. They get regular phone calls from the DA's office updating them on the progress of the case. They, if there is a stay issued or relief granted, they will get dug up by the DA to go on TV and talk about it. And then they have to, or have the opportunity to, attend the execution, and they will be notified about that, asked about it. Their names will be printed all over again in the paper when it happens. It's a very long, invasive process. And he didn't want that for his family. And he also is just against execution in principle and didn't have any interest in seeing it pursued on the family's behalf. And I mean, I there are so many reasons I admire my husband. But one of those is, he is a principled person. And, we learn virtue from watching it demonstrated by a more competent other. And that did inform my thinking. And it helped me develop my own resolve.
It made it more real for you, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Actually have Someone have to make that decision for real rather than
right. And it made the demonstration of that virtue all the more obviously beautiful. That if you really, really want to defend the indelible fact of human dignity, it's very easy to select a case like, a really superlative figure. The guy who figured out how to genetically engineer crops so everybody could have wheat no matter the climate. You name your Nobel-winning scientist, Jonas Salk.
That's
someone who develops a polio vaccine and doesn't patent it intentionally so all children can be vaccinated. There's your argument for indelible human dignity. But no, if you really want to defend it, you have to go the furthest down into the deepest, darkest underbelly of humanity.
Has to be the worst case to test it. And actually what that means, of course, if that's your motivation for opposing the death penalty, then it means that some of the tactical arguments that are used are actually, in the end, superfluous to your case. Because, so for example, people say, well, some of them might be innocent, and there's, 4%, or so. There's that. Then there's the question of, like, they didn't do the thing they're accused of doing. So in the case, in Bourgeois' case, that he didn't rape his daughter, and if that was the thing that tipped because the evidence was inconclusive, as you show, then maybe that wasn't. But actually, in the end, even if you had 100% certainty that they had done the most horrific crime imaginable, that wouldn't alter your position. So those are sort of tactical moves that are made by anti-death penalty campaigners, which in the end don't count for you, right? If you had 100% certainty, totally heinous crime, you'd still be against putting them to death. So, whereas for some people, I think it's like, okay, if I knew for sure, there's no shadow of a doubt, and it was that terrible, then I'd be in favor of it. So there's a difference in the motivation between some people on this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a difference in principle there. I think all of those arguments are, to varying degrees. I don't like all of them, but to varying degrees, the tactical, the sort of policy complaints or the efficacy complaints about the death penalty are useful because different people are persuaded by different weaknesses in the system, and there are many. And so all of those things are true. The expense aspect of it is another. It's extremely expensive compared to not executing someone. Arizona just spent $1.5 million on pentobarbital so they can resume executions, right? I mean, there's no reason to throw that kind of money away. But so that's
the argument you make. So you've got an argument for fiscal conservatives, you've got an argument for jurisprudence, etc. But
right.
But as I say, there are those for whom in the end they are second order questions, not first order ones. I wanted to ask you about life imprisonment, because you make the point that Alfred Bourgeois was going to die in jail anyway. I actually saw that the Supreme Court just upheld lifetime for someone called Brett Jones, who was 15 when he murdered his grandfather. But I also note that Pope Francis is against life imprisonment, at least as a default. He said in 2014 that a sentence of life without parole is a hidden death penalty, and it's been removed from the Vatican Penal Code. So he's describing life imprisonment as a hidden death penalty. And I think this is important because sometimes in polling, and I'm going to ask you about polling in a moment, actually the question put to people is death versus life in prison. And so it's actually used as a way to draw out people's views about the death penalty. But there's also a real deep issue here about the role of the criminal justice system altogether. So are you with Pope Francis on the hidden death penalty of life sentence as well?
Yeah, I think it's a next order concern for me. So I would say that my concern about the death penalty is fundamentally different than my concern about life without parole. I'm concerned about both. Death penalty is a different moral category for me. I would say that LWOP, it vastly diminished the death penalty in Texas.
Sorry, you're going to say that?
LWOP, life without parole, LWOP.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought you were referring to something from Lord of the Rings or something.
No,
the
criminal defense attorneys call it.
You're really into this. I mean,
I talk to them every day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And so, life without parole, it vastly diminished death sentences in Texas. I mean, if you want to look at why was Harris County once the killingest county in the country, not only did it send more people to Texas death row than any other county in Texas, it sent more people to death row than most states in the country. Why did that change? Because of life without parole. It was only introduced to the Texas Penal Code relatively recently. And at that point, juries just didn't see the point of going through with, capital sentencing. It's longer, it's harder. Prosecutors realized that jurors who might have hangups about sentencing someone to death had much fewer about sentencing someone to life without parole. It just seemed to tie up a lot of loose ends, and it made things easier on the system. And it saved lives. Now, the question is, well, at what cost, right? It saved life at the expense of quality of life.
Right.
And,
but it does still open up the possibility for redemption. It does open up the possibility,
sure,
albeit not possibly release. So I can see why for you it's a next order question. In a sense, that's a fight for another day, rather than for now. And you mentioned actually the money that was spent by Arizona on the drug, and that actually brings me to the question of public opinion on this. And it's super interesting that the pentobarbital had to be shipped with unmarked labels. That actually Trump was able to. I mean, actually, Trump and Barr, in order to make this happen at all, they had to solve this problem of getting the drugs. And actually, I was in the coalition government in the UK with the Liberal Democrats, and one of our small but proudest achievements was actually stopping the UK selling drugs to the US for the death penalty. Yeah. So it's getting harder and harder to get it. They had to shield the identity of the drug companies providing it, right? That's pretty interesting. That tells us something about public opinion, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So this is bad business for drug companies. It's bad business for drug companies for a couple of reasons. One, there's just next to no market for these lethal drugs. And so if you're only going to be selling high concentrations of thiopental or pentobarbital or what have you to state and the federal government, then it's just not worth the production costs. But they'll do it. However, when you add in people protesting and boycotting the companies, not only domestically but internationally for doing this, then it becomes really not worth it. And so lots of them not only have tricky Europeans slowly cut off the United States supply.
There's less of it coming across the Atlantic.
There's less of it. Italy used to send a lot. The EU told them to knock it off. They knocked it off. Great Britain, Denmark, the huge pharmaceutical supplier, they won't do it. And so the United States, they can produce these things domestically. The companies don't like to do it because it's just not worth it for them. Barr said, I'll protect you. I'll hide your identity. So far, that's been successful. I feel like that sort of thing doesn't actually always last because somewhere in Arizona, somewhere in the Bureau of Prisons, there's paperwork that lists the contractors because there's just a huge amount of bureaucracy that has to be gone through to do government contracting. So I don't think that those promises of anonymity are going to hold up forever. In fact, Reuters figured out which drug companies were selling it to the feds already.
Oh, really?
They had an investigation they published last year. And so it's just a matter of time with the states. And I think that, is fascinating. It's totally possible that the pentobarbital in Arizona is coming from a compounding pharmacy run out of someone's garage. Like, we have no idea where it's coming from.
Well, that might be that's the only way that we can get it. But it's very interesting how, just looking at the shift in kind of public opinion, maybe you can help to kind of tell the story of this, because it feels like it really was the 90s where there was both a peak in death, certainly federal death penalty cases, but also if you could kind of public opinion support, seems to have peaked in roughly the kind of mid 90s. This is all part of the war on crime, and then really come down. Although much more among Democrats than Republicans, it seems to become kind of even more associated with party affiliation. But it looks like 90s pretty popular. Much less so today, and especially less so among Democrats. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, I think you see the high water mark in the 90s precisely because this the war on crime, the war on drugs. You have in 86 and then amended in 88 the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, the ADAA, which reinstates the federal death penalty. And it does a bunch of other arguably not great things. But you start seeing a lot of interest in that point at deterring crime by putting the death penalty on the table and occasionally, as Augustine suggests, sort of striking fear into the hearts of would-be criminals by liberally giving it out. And the thing is that doesn't seem correlated with a drop in crime.
Yeah, the evidence for deterrence just isn't there, really, is it?
It's not really there, right? I mean, so I can't speak to particular cases. It's certainly, it does a lot of strange things. The death penalty, this is why I like to talk about evil. It's so evil that it warps everything around it. So because the death penalty is on the table, people will confess to things they didn't do, to plea. People will, they're extremely nervous about going to trial, and so they'll do whatever they can to get around it. At that point, the prosecutor just completely has them on a leash. I mean, say whatever you want, they'll confess to it. This means that if people are confessing to things they didn't do, then crimes are going unsolved, actually. And criminals are still out there who did do this.
You've got the wrong person.
You've got the wrong guy, right? And that's a real phenomenon. You have lots of cases. I think the AIDD keeps a running list of all the people with intellectual disabilities who have confessed falsely and have been exonerated in retrospect. But that's not an uncommon situation. And the death penalty makes that more likely. The death penalty also encourages other people to lie on the stand. So if you have two individuals who are involved in the same crime and you convince one that you've got the death penalty on the table for them unless they testify against the other, they'll do it and they'll lie. And you see an enormous amount of that. You see lawyers doing mitigation that they don't actually really fully believe in. And, it's not a good thing. It warps everything. And I think there's huge recognition at this point that that's the case, and so
hence
it's just kind of declined.
Yeah, the swing in public opinion. Although, it's interesting to me that kind of that Clinton looms really large over all of this. I mean, I'm older than you, so I'm old enough to actually remember Ricky Ray Rector in '92. In fact, I covered Clinton for a short while for The Guardian later. But actually, he left. This is Clinton's campaigning to become president. He actually leaves the campaign trail to go back so that he's kind of back in Arkansas to be there for the execution, to show kind of how tough on crime he is. And some of the acts you're talking about, in fact, the ADIPA, is that I don't know how you say the acronym, but the ADIPA was, he signed that in 96, right? And so actually it's interesting to me how when you look back on Clinton generally, I'm sure you'll have views on this, Clinton generally, you think about the social conservatism. And I speak as someone who's quite a big fan of Clinton, but you look back on a Defense of Marriage Act, death penalty, welfare reform, actually the shift of it. And this was a huge sign of that. I mean, the Democrat, it's hard to overstate how afraid the Democrats were of being seen as soft on crime. And this was a big part of it. And actually you can see just how many Democrats were in favor of the death penalty in the 90s. And how that's shifted since.
This was on the heels of the crack epidemic. And, I certainly understand people being concerned about crime. Nobody wants to be a victim of violent crime. Nobody wants cities to be unlivable because of just sort of endemic crime. And I think those are all, accomplishable without, in retrospect, the kind of policy decisions that were made under Clinton.
Well, it turns out that we've seen probably the biggest decline in violent crime during the period where the death penalty wasn't really being used. So that's not that doesn't prove anything. But it did tick up. Public opinion did tick a little bit up between 16 and 18. Looking at, I guess this is Gallup polling, but actually rose among Catholics by 10 points between 16 and 18, and this might bring us on a little bit to how the politics of this shifted back a little bit under Trump, and particularly among Republicans. So what happened to public opinion in the last 4 years, and how far was that driven by Trump and the people around him, or how far did it kind of predict Trump? I can't really kind of figure out chicken and egg, because I don't remember it being a big deal in 2016. I don't remember it being a particularly big deal on the Republican stage. I mean, I don't actually remember it being a particularly big deal in the 2020 election, to be honest. So
no.
Right. So what was happening here? Why was there even just a slight shift back in favor of it? And what was Trump doing, and what was he hoping to achieve here?
So Trump had talked about on the campaign trail giving the death penalty to people who killed police officers. So it wasn't
This is in 2016.
This is 16.
Yeah.
So this is more about pushing back against, the growing criminal justice reform movements based on police violence against Black people. So Trump was staking a sort of culture war position there by suggesting he would give the death penalty to people who killed police officers, right? He said that. I don't know that he ever actually moved to do anything about that. I think in 2016, if you had asked most people if we even had the federal death penalty, the last person had been executed in 2003 federally. People were not even thinking about it. It's not an important mechanism of carrying out justice in the United States, nor does the federal death penalty exist for like the worst of all bad criminals. It's just people mostly who committed crimes on military bases on accident and things like that. So Brandon Bernard, Alfred Bourgeois were just incidentally on territory that belongs to the federal government. They had no idea. But these were otherwise crimes that would have been prosecuted at the state level in an ordinary fashion.
I hadn't fully grasped that. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
So if
strange,
if
right?
Alfred Bourgeois if this had happened just outside of the military base, I see. So it was. I mean, unless he deliberately did it in a military base, which seems unlikely.
No,
it was just accident.
He was just making a delivery.
It was on federal property. I see. Okay.
Right, and that happens all over the place because there are little patches of federal ground all over the place. And so it's sort of weird and arbitrary. And again, it had only been reinstated in the 90s, and then it had ended essentially in 2003. So there just wasn't a lot of energy behind it. However, Bill Barr is a man of the 90s. And he had quite a bit of interest in resuming these executions. Now, I think you have to see Trump and Barr's interest in executions as an entry in this culture war over law enforcement, right? This is about Blue Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. It's about amping up the conservative feeling of we have to be extremely hard, extremely unforgiving, and opposed to reform in the criminal justice system, or else we're going to fall victim to whatever mayhem. It is worth saying that crime's up. And there
2020,
have been
absolutely, yeah,
major spikes in homicide in major cities, and I don't see the Democrats coming up with any ideas of what to do about that, which I think if they don't acknowledge it and come up with a theory of why it's happening and a theory for pushing back on that or trying to solve some of these problems, I think they're just going to get murdered in the midterms.
I actually
slaughtered.
completely agree with you. I said to someone the other day, if I was advising them, I'd have two charts. I'd have the chart in the rise in violent crime in our cities and a chart in the number of people crossing the border. Since Biden came in, I would literally run on that, and you run on control, order, enforcement, and you basically run on a campaign, which is the Democrats have lost control of our cities and they've lost control of our border. And there is enough evidence that you can marshal to support those claims, polemical though they are, that I think that could be quite politically effective. I
mean, people have all kinds of politics and all kinds of opinions, but not liking violent crime is pretty universal. And you see that it powered this major kind of reactionary push in the 90s. And there's no reason it can't do that again. And to add another disturbing factor into the mix, Barr taught every red state how to get pentobarbital. So everyone who had been unable to carry out the number of executions they wanted, or to carry out executions at all because they weren't able to source these drugs, now they know how to source these drugs. It's very possible you're going to see a surge
at a state level. Okay, but actually, let's just pause. Let's just dig into this a bit, because we didn't. The last one was in 2003. The way you reported is that there was this issue, as I understand it, with sourcing the drugs in particular and so on. And that particularly under Obama, it was like, okay, fine. Well, let's not try too hard, right? It wasn't like no one came out and started repealing laws or saying we're against the death penalty, but just like let's just let it lie. And it did lie for 17 years, as you kind of show. What did Barr do? What was the problem that Obama didn't really try very hard to solve that Barr did solve?
So what the litigation was that held up the federal death penalty was it was a case called Roan, and it had to do with this 3-drug cocktail that was being used under Bush. A 3-drug lethal injection cocktail. They've tried lots of different what they call execution protocols over the years with lethal injection. This one, theoretically included a sedative element that would render the whole procedure of execution painless because the individual would be under sedation essentially, and then you have the paralytic and so on. And there were real questions about whether or not this was working the way it was supposed to work, and therefore there were Eighth Amendment questions, cruel and unusual punishment. And so that litigation took forever, and it had tons of plaintiffs on death row, and the question, how does this lethal injection cocktail actually work, had to be answered. So there were tons of depositions, there were research. And under Obama, his Justice Department just wasn't really interested in finding the drugs. So at some point they came to court and said, look, this is all kind of moot anyway, because we don't have the drugs, we can't get them. And so there's really no point in us pursuing it right now. And so it just laid there. When Barr got in there, he had his plan for getting a hold of pentobarbital without putting the companies at risk. He solved that problem. He had Pento. And so he started, there were plaintiffs on federal death row who were not a part of that litigation. He started setting dates. He
just had to solve the drug. He solved so it shows that it was at least solvable in that sense if it with the political will. Did it help in the 2020 election? And again, it might just mean me not paying attention, but I just don't recall it being that big an issue. And you think if you've gone to all this trouble to solve that and actually execute, non-trivial number of people, that you'd see some political upside if there was political upside. But was there any evidence of that?
I don't think so. I think that Trump had a problem, and that is, who is going to care about you executing 13 people when 100,000 have died of coronavirus in the last whatever months? I mean, it was just completely blasted out of the news by everything else that was going on. And so the one way in which I think that the Republicans did get some traction was there was one execution of Brandon Bernard that caught the attention of Kim Kardashian. And so there was this moment of sort of liberal uproar and outrage over this particular execution, but it was fleeting. And another thing that Barr did... You
remember that? It was like a 24-hour tweet storm, and that was it, really.
Right. And Barr would schedule 3 executions in a week, and the press just gets tired of it, right? There's, you can't do 3 big execution stories a week.
You're right. Plus, with the pandemic and what was happening to the economy and so on, then you can see how that wouldn't necessarily kind of cut through. Although, given the conversation we just had about the midterms, I wonder if they'll be able to look back to it and contrast it with Dem inactivity on it since. And that actually brings me to kind of what now, I guess, because you've got interesting, Biden, who at the time, back in the mid-90s, was a man of the 90s, to use your phrase, and strongly supportive of it, but now says he abhors the death penalty. And there is, and you reported on this, Democrats have introduced the Federal Death Penalty Abolition Act. Obviously, Supreme Court will be interesting given its kind of composition now, but what do you see as the potential next steps in terms of kind of moving away from the death penalty? We've had this 17-year hiatus followed by the sort of death rush from Barr and Trump. Now we've got Biden in the White House and Dems in charge of Congress. Do you expect there to be any progress? If not, why not?
I think now is, let me put it this way. I expect more regress than progress at the moment.
because of the context of the rising crime.
Right, because of the rise in crime, because the red states now know how to get Pinto, because they know that the Supreme Court is not going to stop them. There are just no more barriers and there are no deterrents. And even if it doesn't help them politically, it certainly doesn't hurt them with their constituency. And I think if crime continues to rise and Republicans do run against Democrats on spiraling crime, then they will be able to use it to help themselves, with a sort of classic 90s tough on crime platform.
So even if something were to happen at the federal level, and it seems like the median bet there would be for nothing to happen, really, and in either direction, probably, right? I mean,
suspect.
Do you expect this act to get through Congress or the Senate?
I hope it does. I mean, I've written about it. I support it. I think, Biden is also a very cautious politician. And I emailed with Biden's press folks repeatedly. We're all working on that story and said, just what does he think? And they just fundamentally don't want to supply anything more than he's already said, which is, I abhor it, I'm against it. But without taking any action. I mean, I think they really fear putting chum in the water, right? If he comes out hardcore against the death penalty, that's just going to tee it up
for the Republic. Yeah, I'm sure that to some extent they'd rather just, as I said, kind of let it lie. But it is interesting. You can imagine red states and governors from red states and candidates, positioning themselves for the presidency. As you say, now that Barr's got rid of some of the obstacles and the Supreme Court's not going to get in the way, actually doing a Clinton effectively. I mean, being the one saying, we're the ones doing something about this. We're the ones who are using the death penalty. All these blue states are running away from it, and Biden's running away from it, and playing effectively a kind of Clintonian tough on crime. In that sense, 2022 could be 92 redux, right? 40 years on.
Yes, the Capitol defense attorneys are worried that that's about to happen, and I think all of the ingredients are, unfortunately in the mix. And I don't know what to do about that. I mean, historical forces are bigger than us. In terms of doing the right thing morally, you just bear witness. It's still worthwhile to stand athwart history and say, that's wrong. This is wrong. What we're doing is very wrong.
Well, you've certainly been doing that, Liz. I think you're right that the politics, as it turns out, could be particularly difficult right now. And it'll be fascinating to see how this unfolds. But you have at least drawn attention in a way that I don't think others were to what's been happening and to some of the risks around this. I want to commend you on that reporting. What's next for you? Are you going to keep this as you've been on this issue for a fair while now? I'm not saying it's the only thing you're writing about, but obviously you've been kind of focused on this. It feels like probably gone about as far as you can in terms of your writing on this. I may be wrong about that, but what's next on your agenda?
Yeah, I've been thinking about sort of creative ways to get deeper into it without sort of retracing my footsteps. It's possible I will come up with a way to do that, and impossible I will not. I have several other pieces that have to do with the criminal justice system, not necessarily with capital punishment, in the works. And I have some pieces relating to labor. And I think that those are the things that seem really strong and promising to me right now. And I, kind of stumble into new ideas all the time. But yeah,
but it's interesting. You're broadening it out, because I think underpinning your views about the death penalty are views about the role of criminal justice more generally. I've actually got Martha Nussbaum coming on at some point and to talk about forgiveness and punishment. And she talks about the difference between a payback justice and future-oriented justice, and the role of the criminal justice system. So if it is like you've done the crime, you serve the time, there's a sort of retributive, it's the institutionalization of revenge. She writes very, very nicely about how the Furies were tamed by Athena and so on, but that's a very Nussbaum.
The kindly ones.
Yes, exactly. Yes, the kindly ones, how they became the kindly ones, and her hope that's what our justice system is about, that it's, and actually deterrence, of course, could be future looking, right? If the role is to deter future crime, that does make it future oriented, but it's not about retribution. It's not about seeking to avenge the wrong. There's a wrong here, so there's a wrong there. And the death penalty seems to me to just be the most obvious and extreme example of a whole philosophy of criminal justice. And it sounds like you're going to dig into that a bit more. Is that right?
Absolutely. I hope to do that. I think that a big part of that, I actually wrote about forgiveness this weekend in the Sunday Review, but a big part of that is just the acceptance of brokenness. And ultimately, when we refuse to carry out the death penalty, despite the fact that some crimes really are head and shoulders above others, right, in terms of malice, heinousness, cruelty, there are really shocking and abhorrent crimes that are categorically different than other kinds of crime. And I fully believe that. And I think when we decline to give the death penalty even for those crimes, what we're saying is, I am not going to help you destroy yourself. I'm not going to participate in the degradation of yourself and society that you have undertaken. No, absolutely not.
And what does that mean for lesser crimes? What's the purpose of someone who hasn't committed such a heinous crime? And we've sort of the idea of some of these no parole, right, brings us back to this kind of sense of the level of kind of how punitive should we be? What's the justification? Why are we putting people in jail at all? I guess is what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, you hope that there's a deterrent aspect. There is a punitive aspect. You hope to keep it proportional. And hopefully to measure and try to understand what is actually useful. The goal is to eliminate recidivism to the greatest degree possible. And I would put a ton of my energy in that. And therefore, prison should be a place where there's a meaningful rehabilitation taking place. And so that means changing a lot of things about the way that we do criminal justice now. I mean, and how we treat the people. Yeah, I think actually the recidivism rate is a pretty good candidate for a metric of how successful our criminal justice system is in achieving its goals. And it gets way too little attention. You look at who's in jail and who's not in jail and should they be in jail. But recidivism is sort of the metric that doesn't get enough attention, in my view. And our criminal justice system is very good at causing recidivism, essentially. People go to prison, they go to jail, they're badly mistreated. They are essentially traumatized in a lot of cases with rampant sexual assault and abuse by prison authorities, not given health care, any kind of counseling or training. And then they're released back into a society that fundamentally hates felons, right? They can't get work. They can't rent units to live in. And so they are put back in a position where essentially the criminal activity they were doing before becomes, even more appealing, if not their only option.
It's almost a miracle when people don't.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's this great, wonderful Atlantic essay that Ta-Nehisi quotes is about the great grey wastes of the kind of criminal justice and the description of it being around there. Well, look forward to more of your writing on this, Liz, as well as, of course, following your valorization of domestic labor on Twitter alongside of this. You can anybody that can move from doing the kind of work you're doing and the difficult work you're doing on the death penalty to the brightness that you very often show and through your social media accounts is definitely bringing good to the world. So thank you for that, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.